you folks have sent in some really interesting stuff this time around about Canada and the U.S.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of you are kind of wrestling with this question of, U.S. influence on Canada.
Right.
How much is there?
Yeah.
Is it a problem?
Yeah.
And what can everyday Canadians actually do about it?
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've got excerpts from an article here called Breaking Free from U.S. Influence.
Interesting.
And just a ton of comments from other Canadians. So let's dive in.
It is fascinating stuff. It goes way beyond simple economics. It's a big question about what it means for a country to define its own identity in this globalized world.
And the article really kicks off by painting this picture of Canada's, historical dependence on the U.S. for trade investment. You name it.
Absolutely. And it uses a really striking example, the crude oil industry. For decades, Canada's been, really reliant on selling its oil to the U.S. But we've seen recent pipeline disputes and shifting U.S. energy priorities. And I think that's really exposed the vulnerability of that dependence.
Yeah, that brings us to something that a lot of the commenters brought up, which is the trade war a few years back. Even though it's, cooled down.
Yeah.
It seems like it left a mark on a lot of Canadians.
Absolutely. It was a real wake-up call. The article suggests that, things can change so quickly.
Right.
And Canada can be really vulnerable when so much of its economy is tied to one trading partner.
Yeah.
Some of the comments about this were pretty intense.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's some real anger and resentment out there.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
One person even said that the damage is done forever.
Wow.
But alongside that anger, there's a lot of talk about what Canadians can actually do.
Okay.
There's a real buy local movement brewing.
Yeah, that's a theme we see a lot in both the article and the comments, this idea that Canadians can exert some influence through their consumer choices. Supporting Canadian businesses and potentially lessening reliance on U.S. goods.
Yeah.
But of course, there's a bigger picture here.
Right. A lot of folks are calling for broader changes, like diversifying trade partners.
Yeah, exactly.
The article points to the EU and China as possibilities.
Makes sense.
Which makes sense. But what are the realistic chances of shifting away from such a massive integrated market like the U.S.?
It's definitely a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is this isn't just about economics.
Okay.
Many Canadians are concerned about the cultural influence as well.
Right.
Particularly the dominance of U.S. media.
So it's not just about where our oil goes or where we buy our clothes.
Yeah.
It's about whose stories we're consuming.
Exactly. There's this feeling that being bombarded with U.S. news and entertainment all the time really shapes how Canadians see the world.
Yeah.
And maybe even limits their sense of their own national identity.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Some commenters are even suggesting a more conscious effort to seek out Canadian media as a way to counter that influence.
To push back a little bit.
Yeah.
So we're talking about individual choices, but also about bigger systemic changes.
Yeah.
The article mentions investing in Canadian innovation and technology
Right.
as a way to become less reliant on U.S. supply chains. Does that seem feasible?
Well, it's complex. Canada certainly has a lot of potential in areas like clean tech and AI. But fostering that kind of innovation requires a really supportive policy environment. And that's where the political dimension comes in.
Right. A lot of the comments emphasize the need for Canadians to get involved in politics.
Yes.
To push for policies that prioritize Canadian interests.
And it's not just about voting.
Right.
It's about holding elected officials accountable, advocating for specific changes, and maybe even questioning some long-held assumptions about Canada's place in the world.
So far, we've talked a lot about the economic and cultural aspects of this relationship. But what about the political side?
Yeah.
How much autonomy does Canada really have when it comes to things like foreign policy and international relations?
That's a key question, and that's where things get really nuanced. Canada and the U.S. obviously have this long history of cooperation, and their economies are deeply intertwined.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean Canada has to simply follow the U.S.'s lead on every issue.
And that seems to be a point of contention for a lot of the commenters.
Yeah.
They're tired of feeling like Canada's just going along with whatever the U.S. wants.
Right.
Whether it's joining military interventions or adopting certain economic policies.
It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Maintaining strong ties with the U.S. while also asserting Canada's own interests and values.
Right.
It's a delicate dance.
It is.
It requires careful consideration of both the benefits and the risks of close alignment with such a powerful neighbor.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how can Canadians actually push for more independent foreign policy?
Well, the article suggests it starts with building a stronger sense of national identity.
Okay, so what does that mean? More maple syrup and hockey.
Not quite. It's about recognizing and valuing what makes Canada unique. It's about having confidence in Canadian institutions and the ability to make decisions that are in Canada's best interests, even if those decisions sometimes diverge from what the U.S. might want.
So less about symbols and more about substance.
Yeah.
Like taking a stand on issues that matter to Canadians, even if it means ruffling some feathers south of the border.
Exactly. It's about shaping a foreign policy that reflects Canadian values and priorities, not just reacting to whatever's happening in Washington.
Yeah.
And that kind of shift requires a pretty fundamental change in mindset,
right?
Both among policymakers and the public.
All right, so we've got this complex picture, historical dependence, growing unease, and a desire for change.
For sure.
But the big question remains, can Canada really break free from U.S. influence?
Right.
And what would that even look like in practice?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
The article doesn't argue for a complete severing of ties.
Right.
That's not realistic or even desirable.
No.
It's more about strategic moves like diversifying trade partners, strengthening Canadian industries, and cultivating that stronger sense of national identity we talked about.
So all of that requires individual action, Annie D., systemic change.
Absolutely. It's a multifaceted challenge.
Yeah.
It'll take time, effort, and a willingness to grapple with some tough questions.
Sure.
But what we see in these comments is that Canadians are engaged, they're thinking critically about this, and they're ready to have this conversation.
And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about economics or politics. It's about who Canadians are and who they want to be in the world.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. Yeah. We've laid out a lot of the complexities here.
Yeah.
And in the next part, we can really dig into some of the potential paths forward.
Okay.
And what those might mean for Canada's future.
Sounds good to me.
All right.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Okay, so we've got this complex picture, right, of the relationship between Canada and the U.S.
Right.
Historical dependence, anxieties about influence, and then this yearning for something more.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? Is breaking free even possible? What would that actually look like?
That's the real question here.
Yeah.
And the article doesn't doesn't shy away from the challenges at all.
Okay.
It acknowledges that untangling decades of economic and cultural ties,
right,
it's not going to be easy.
It's like trying to turn a giant ship. Right.
Exactly.
It takes
time.
And a lot of effort.
And a lot of coordination.
Yeah.
And then, there's the question of political will, too. Are Canadians truly ready to embrace a more independent path?
Right.
Especially if it means, potential economic costs or disruptions in the short term.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah.
We saw how Canadians kind of rallied together during that trade war. There was this sense of we're in this together.
Right.
But can that momentum be sustained?
Yeah.
What would it take for Buy Canadian to become more than just a slogan?
It's a key question for sure. It's one thing to feel patriotic during a crisis. It's another to actually make lasting changes in our everyday choices, buying habits, investment decisions, even just staying informed about Canadian issues.
The article seems to suggest that a big part of it is about shifting our mindset. It talks about the need to cultivate a stronger sense of Canadian identity.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean?
What does that look like?
Yeah.
Well, it goes beyond just those symbols, hockey and poutine. It's about really recognizing and valuing what makes Canada unique.
Right.
Its culture, its values, its place in the world.
So not just what we buy, but how we see ourselves as a nation.
Exactly. It's about having confidence in Canadian institutions, industries, and ultimately in the ability to make decisions that are truly in Canada's best interests.
Yeah, I think that resonates with a lot of the comments that we saw.
Okay.
People are tired of feeling like Canada's just following the U.S.'s lead.
Yeah.
They want Canada to have a more distinct voice on the world stage.
And that ties back to the political engagement piece we talked about. If Canadians want a more independent Canada, they need to elect leaders who will champion those values.
It's interesting because the article isn't just like an economic argument. It's about what kind of country Canada wants to be.
It really highlights how those economic choices are also expressions of who we are as a nation.
Right.
What kind of future do Canadians want to build, and how can they use their collective economic power to get there?
But even with the best intentions, there's this this huge elephant in the room, right? No matter how much we talk about breaking free, Canada and the U.S. are still deeply intertwined.
Absolutely. That shared border, the history of economic cooperation.
Right.
The countless cultural connections.
All of it, yeah.
It's a complex relationship, to say the least.
So what does that mean for the future? Are we destined to always be in the U.S.'s shadow?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
The article, along with a lot of the comments, suggests that Canada needs to be more intentional about its relationship with the U.S.
Okay.
It's not about cutting ties completely,
right,
but finding a better balance.
So a balance between cooperation and independence.
Exactly.
Between economic integration and national sovereignty.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that balance is likely to keep evolving as the global landscape changes and Canada's own priorities shift.
So it's not about a clean break, but about navigating this, this complex and ever-changing relationship.
Right.
In a way that serves Canada's best interests.
And it's important to remember there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for Canada might not work for other countries facing similar challenges.
Right.
Each nation has its own unique set of circumstances and its own path to forge.
Speaking of paths.
Yeah.
This deep dive has raised some really interesting questions about the road ahead for Canada. What will the next chapter in this relationship look like?
Yeah.
How will Canadians define their place in the world?
It's a story that's still being written.
Yeah.
And it's a story that every Canadian has a role in shaping.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even in a world of complex geopolitical forces, individual actions and choices still matter.
They do.
But it also makes me wonder, what are some of the things that are maybe OUT of Canadians' control? What if the U.S. just keeps throwing its weight around no matter what Canada does?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And honestly, there are no easy answers.
Right.
But I think what's important is that Canadians are having these conversations, that they're aware of the potential risks.
Because awareness is the first step to action.
Exactly. And even if there are limits to what individuals can do, there's power in collective action.
Yeah.
We saw that during the trade war. Canadians came together, they supported each other, and they sent a message.
So it's not about being naive or pretending that Canada can magically become completely independent overnight.
Yeah.
It's about being strategic, making informed choices, and working together to create a future where Canada has a stronger voice.
Yes.
And a more secure place in the world.
I agree.
But that brings up another question.
Okay, what's that?
We've talked a lot about big picture things, like trade deals and foreign policy.
Right.
But what can everyday people actually do to contribute to this vision of a more independent Canada? Besides buying Canadian, of course.
That's where things get really interesting, because it turns out there are a lot of concrete actions individuals can take.
Okay.
And they actually align quite closely with what a lot of the commenters were suggesting.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
All right. Well, first, there's the power of informed consumer choice. We talked about buy Canadian.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond that.
Okay.
It's about being conscious of where your money is going, supporting businesses that align with your values, and maybe even seeking out alternatives to U.S. products when possible.
It's about putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly. And it's not just about goods.
Okay.
It's about services, entertainment, even information. We talked about the influence of U.S. media.
Yeah.
Well, one way to counter that is to actively seek out Canadian voices and perspectives.
Right. Supporting Canadian artists, musicians, writers, filmmakers.
Yeah. That all contributes to a stronger sense of Canadian culture.
Right.
But what about the political side of things? What can individuals do beyond just voting?
There's so much more. You can contact your elected officials and let them know what issues you care about.
Right.
You can join organizations that are advocating for policies that align with your vision of a more independent Canada.
Okay.
You can volunteer your time donate to causes you believe in, and even just have conversations with your friends and family about these issues.
So it's about using your voice, your time, and your resources to create the kind of change you want to see.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Right.
When millions of people start making different choices, it can shift the political landscape, influence business practices, and even reshape cultural norms.
That's actually really inspiring.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel powerless when you think about the scale of these challenges, the scale of it all.
Yeah, but it sounds like there's a lot individuals can do to make a difference.
Absolutely.
But how do we know if it's working? What are the signs that Canada is actually moving towards a more independent path?
That's a great question, and I think it's something we'll be grappling with for years to come.
Yeah.
There's no single metric for measuring independence.
Right.
And it's likely to be an ongoing process of negotiation and evolution rather than a sudden dramatic shift.
So we need to look for subtle indicators.
Yeah.
Like shifts in trade patterns, changes in public discourse,
Right.
and maybe even a growing confidence in Canada's ability to chart its own course.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that there will be setbacks.
Sure.
Disagreements and ongoing debates about what independence actually means and how to achieve it.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's a journey that requires patience, persistence,
Yeah.
and a willingness to embrace complexity.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the possibilities, and even some concrete actions people can take.
Right.
But before we wrap up, I think there's one more thing we need to address.
Yeah.
We've talked about individual actions and systemic changes.
Right.
But I keep coming back to this idea of how do we measure progress? How do we actually know if Canada is becoming more independent?
Yeah.
Are there any concrete indicators we can look for?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it's tough because there's no single independence meter we can just check.
Right.
It's more about observing trends and shifts over time.
So what kind of trends should we be paying attention to?
Well, think about things like trade diversification.
Okay.
Are we seeing Canadian businesses forging stronger ties with partners beyond the US?
Yeah.
Are there new markets opening up for Canadian goods and services?
So looking for signs that Canada is becoming less reliant on the U.S. economically?
Exactly. And it goes beyond just trade numbers.
Okay.
What about investment?
Yeah.
Are we seeing more Canadian companies investing in other countries?
Oh.
And are we attracting investment from a wider range of international sources?
Okay, that makes sense. What about the cultural side of things?
Yeah.
Any indicators there?
One thing to watch is the media landscape. Are we seeing more diverse voices and perspectives in Canadian media? Are Canadians consuming more content from Canadian creators?
Right.
Those could be signs of a growing sense of cultural independence.
Interesting. So it's not just about rejecting U.S. influence.
Right.
It's about fostering a richer, more diverse cultural landscape within Canada.
Exactly. And that kind of cultural shift can have a big impact on how Canadians view themselves and their place in the world.
Right.
It can contribute to that stronger sense of national identity that the article talked about.
What about the political realm? Are there any signs that Canada is becoming more assertive on the world stage?
That's a tricky one because foreign policy is often, subtle and behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's hard to see.
But you might look for things like Canada taking a more independent stance on certain international issues, even if it means disagreeing with the U.S.
So maybe a willingness to go it alone on issues that matter to Canadians?
Yeah.
Even if it causes some friction with our southern neighbors.
Exactly. And it might also involve building stronger relationships with other countries and international organizations.
Yeah.
Diversifying our diplomatic efforts.
Right.
And showcasing Canadian expertise and leadership on the global stage.
So it's a multifaceted picture.
Yeah.
Economic shifts, cultural changes, and political moves, all contributing to a more independent Canada.
And it's important to remember this is an ongoing process, not a finished product. There will be successes and setbacks, disagreements and debates.
Of course.
But what's encouraging is that this conversation is happening.
Yeah.
And Canadians are engaged in shaping their own future.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
This isn't just a theoretical debate.
Right.
It's about real people making choices, advocating for change, working to create a Canada they believe in.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about politics or economics. It's about identity values.
Yeah.
And what it means to be Canadian in a complex and ever-changing world.
To our listener who sent in these materials, we hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives on this complex issue.
For sure.
And remember, there are no easy answers.
Right.
But there are opportunities to engage.
Absolutely.
To make your voice heard and to contribute to shaping the kind of future you want to see for Canada.
And who knows, maybe in a few years we'll be revisiting this topic.
Yeah.
Looking back on all the progress that's been made.
That would be great.
Until then, keep asking those tough questions. Keep pushing for change and keep believing in the power of your own voice.
That's it for this deep dive.
Okay.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
That's good.
Of the ideas that matter.